Welcome, everyone, to this Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism lunchtime seminar. I'm David Feldman. I'm the director of the Institute. Just to say what will happen, our speaker, Emilie Wiedemann, will talk for about half an hour, and then that will be followed by about an equal amount of time for questions and discussion. If you want to raise a question or make a point, please raise your hand in the chat, and I'll call on you. So it's a huge pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who is Emilie Wiedemann from the University of Glasgow. At Glasgow, Emilie is working on a British Academy funded project on race, identity, and political mobilization in France and Britain between 1970 and the present. Before then, however, Emilie was a PhD student here at Birkbeck. She completed her PhD last year. It was last year. It was 23 in 2023, towards the end of 2023, on Jewish internationalism and the international politics of opposing anti-Semitism between 1960 and 2005. And her paper today comes out of and builds on that work, on a paper on Jewish advocacy and anti-racism at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban 2001 and its aftermath. Emilie, it's all yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, David, and for inviting me to speak, and everyone for attending today. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Okay, and everyone can see that okay. Okay, so as you can see here, I'll be talking about Jewish advocacy at the United Nations World Conference Against Racism in Durban in South Africa in 2001. So the Durban Conference has arguably been one of the more controversial UN events in recent decades. The politics of condemning Israel during the anti-racism conference were a huge driver of this controversy, which led to the walkout of the Israeli and American delegations. So my talk today won't focus directly on this diplomatic controversy, but rather on the activities of non-governmental organizations or NGOs in advance of and during this event. A number of Jewish NGOs were among the several thousand who attended the NGO Forum, a second event hosted by the UN. As has been well documented, and as we will see, their experiences were overwhelmingly negative. This paper will pay close attention to the politics of the NGOs in Durban and examine Jewish advocacy and its reception in this context. So to do this, I will first introduce the context of the NGO Forum. I'll then discuss Jewish involvement in the forum and the specific claims Jewish NGOs made, how these were interacted with the politics of other NGOs. Finally, I'll unpick the immediate legacy of this experience in Jewish politics in the discussion of the changes to international anti-racist Jewish advocacy in the new millennium. So we'll start with just talking about what was the UN World Conference Against Racism and the NGO Forum. So as noted, we need to bear in mind that these were two events. The NGO Forum was specifically hosted for NGOs engaged broadly in an anti-racist cause, many of whom it was understood would also be victims of racism. So around 8,000 to 10,000 NGOs attended, and although some took part in the governmental conference, the vast majority were in South Africa, not only for the NGO Forum, It took place 1 week before the state event in a large cricket stadium in Durban. It was not in fact managed by the UN itself, but was led by a South African NGO called Sangoko, whose history was in anti-apartheid activism. So the purpose of the forum was to influence diplomatic procedures. So a portion of the NGOs present worked on two documents which sought to fulfill this aim. the NGO Declaration and Plan of Action, which were intended to be presented to states at the inception of the government event. In this sense, advocacy among NGOs also indirectly targeted state delegations. But it was also a place for NGOs to meet, discuss, and cultivate transnational alliances. Above all, NGO representatives in attendance looked forward to having a real impact on the UN's approach to racism and felt that stakes were high. So a quote here from activist Eric Mann sums up and illustrates something of what the forum meant to some of the NGOs attending. So he says a workshop to evaluate the capacity of NGOs to impact the policies of the UN. The preparation for the NGO state events happened in tandem from around 18 months before the conference, during 3 preparatory committees known as PrepComs, 4 regional meetings, and additional drafting events. At each, NGOs and states representatives met to draft their respective documents ahead of the event. So these were charged and intense meetings with lots of negotiation on the very precise wording on certain documents. Jewish NGOs were involved in these preparations at every stage. First, a small number were accredited to attend the UN meetings for the government preparations and also attended government PrepComs as well as NGO ones. A second, larger number were directly involved in the NGO forum preparations and gave input to the NGO documents without attending any state events. Together, these groups formed what would be known as the Jewish Caucus. A caucus was a fairly common structure at UN conferences, the idea being to streamline advocacy around a common interest and a unified voice that had a stronger impact. So this was a group that represented Jewish interests as a group at the NGO forum and the conference. There were 39 conferences in Durban, caucuses in Durban. Some were regional, the European or African caucuses. Some were cause-based around issues like criminal justice or trafficking, but the vast majority were identity-based caucuses. So NGOs grouped around a shared identity, whether it be Jewish, indigenous peoples, Arab, Palestinians, or women. The unintended effect of this use of caucuses around identity groups was that it divided the politics of the NGO forum into so-called victim groups. This was also the language used in the forum and in the conference itself. This fostered a particularly factional atmosphere, leading one attendee to describe it as an anti-racist fair with many organizations running booths to advertise their organization and their products. I'm now going to discuss the substance of Jewish advocacy via the Jewish Caucus during the NGO forum and before it. So the source I'm going to use to look into this question is the submission of the Jewish Caucus members to the second PrepCom in Geneva in May 2001. This is one of the most important preparatory meetings for NGOs to draft their documents and one in which Jewish groups were highly engaged. So in the source, the caucus is reacting to an existing draft document of the NGO declaration, which has been circulated by Sangoko, and they are submitting their changes in response. So I will cover these 3 points, 3 advocacy points in the documents. So the first and the most vocal objective of the advocacy in the document was to establish the particularity of anti-Semitism and Jewish experiences within anti-racism in general. So, for example, Jewish NGOs objected to the use of the term Holocaust, sometimes with a lowercase h, to refer to the experiences of people of African descent under slavery and colonization. They requested that, and this is quoting, the uniqueness of the Holocaust be respected, and that the terminology specific to the tragic suffering, resulting from the Black slave trade and the colonization of Africa be used, end quote. Other requests, which may appear as semantics, also had a strong political dimension in this vein. For instance, in asking that the term anti-Semitism be spelled without a hyphen. The hyphenated spelling could be construed to assert the existence of Semitism, and that not only Jews, but also a wider range of so-called Semitic people, including Arab people, were victims of anti-Semitism. The implication here was that Jewish people could also perpetrate anti-Semitism. This was a much more prominent concern at the government conference, where this line was pushed by Arab states. However, Jewish NGOs also discussed removing the hyphen in anti-Semitism in the NGO documents. The second major objective of Jewish NGOs was to defend and protect Israel from claims of racism. So the preparations for Durban unfolded over the first year of the Second Intifada, and the NGO forum preparations were highly attuned to this context. For some Jewish representatives, any mention of Israel in the context of the Anti-Racism Conference was akin to a revival of Resolution 3379, the UN resolution from 1975, which had determined Zionism to be a form of racism and was repealed in 1991. This came out forcefully in the NGO draft of the second PrepCon, which was replete with coded and direct references to Israel as a racist or colonial force. For example, it listed Zionism among the chief causes of racism and contained a politically laden section on foreign occupation. The Jewish caucus objected strongly to what they termed the politicization of the NGO document. They asked that the condemnation of Israel as an occupying power be removed, as well as all mentions of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or else that the document also refer to other regional conflicts. Finally, a third tenet of Jewish advocacy, which brought together these two pillars, was the idea that criticism of Israel at the conference itself reflected or constituted a reported new form of anti-Semitism, one linked to anti-Zionism or new anti-Semitism, as the concept is often known. This concept was by no means a new one in 2001, and had been circulating since the 1960s, but it's worth noting that reports of new anti-Semitism were an increasing factor in Jewish insecurity surge during this period, as reports of anti-Jewish incidents also rose, especially in Europe, which were largely attributed to the Second Intifada. The notion of anti-Zionist anti-Semitism was not a leading cause of the Jewish caucus towards other NGOs. It was a much more explicit part of Israeli advocacy towards other states. Still, elements of this idea were woven into the Jewish caucus's submission to the NGO PrepCon in May 2001. So, in explaining why they had asked for the removal of mentions of Israel, the Jewish caucus included a quote from Martin Luther King: "When people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews. Anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic, and ever will it be so," in an explanation of their requests. This was a slightly different argument to the defense of Israel itself, which I discussed earlier. The first argument claimed that condemning Israel has no place in an anti-racism conference, and that this is a distraction which harms the overall anti-racist cause. The second argument here is that doing so also specifically targets Jews and therefore is not only unhelpful to anti-racism, but also specifically harmful to Jews. Although these early requests in Geneva were granted, Jewish NGOs quickly found themselves to be advocating in an environment often hostile and certainly unsympathetic to their claims. Certainly by early 2001, there had been several flashpoints in the government preparations which had made clear that Arab states would seek explicit condemnations of Israel. Still, the diplomatic weight of the US and European states meant that although these events were disruptive, there was no serious possibility of these claims progressing into key state documents. The NGO forum was a much less predictable political environment. It was also a much more politically radical environment, with groups who sought to push against the political status quo of the state conference. Especially, these targeted the US and Western European states, who formed the Western European Others Group, or WEOG, in the UN, which in this conference also included Israel. Overall, the organizing NGOs and the majority who were attending upheld a conception of anti-racism which was connected to anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. This came out most forcefully around two very visible causes. The first was the flagship issue of the conference in general, which was reparations for slavery and colonialism from former colonial powers. So this had been spearheaded by African and also Latin American and Caribbean states in the United Nations. And the politics of the NGOs at the forum strongly aligned around this cause. The second highly visible cause was support for the Palestinian cause, which was especially prominent at the NGO forum. In the political dynamics of the forum itself, the support was connected to the former cause through a shared history of imperialism and colonial rule. So some Jewish advocacy claims sat uneasily in this political context. In this logic, Palestinians were, in the political logic of the conference, Palestinians were held to be one victim of many of imperialism and also racism, a conception in which Israel was clearly cast in the role of perpetrator. As noted earlier, one of the Jewish caucus's advocacy points was to defend Israel from claims of racism. In this, they allied themselves to the very states other NGOs were attempting to hold to account: the USA, Europe, and Israel. This meant that Jewish groups had a different relationship with these states than the rest of the other NGOs at the forum. This created a tension between the Jewish caucus and the majority of the NGO forum participants, which was expressed in a number of ways in Durban itself during the NGO forum. So it was most explicit in extremely visible support for Palestinians throughout the NGO forum. Several attendees have described this quite literally in the ubiquity of Palestinian flags in the physical space of the stadium. This also includes accounts of Palestinian solidarity being expressed through classically anti-Jewish tropes, the display of Nazi-era cartoons, and the distribution of copies of the Protocol to the Elders of Zion, all contributing to an atmosphere in which Jewish delegates felt not only unwelcome in the anti-racism space, but also physically sometimes unsafe. The political climax of this tension came during the forum final debate and vote on the wording of the NGO declaration. So the Jewish caucus submitted a paragraph on anti-Semitism, which also condemned forms of anti-Zionism and criticism of Israel. The section stated that equating Zionism with racism, delegitimizing Jewish self-determination, and targeting Jews for violence because of their support for Israel were forms of anti-Semitism. This submission was blocked by the World Council of Churches, a longtime supporter of Palestinian statehood, who objected specifically to the clause in anti-Zionism. In response to the adoption of the World Council of Churches' own text, the Jewish caucus walked out of the debate to shouts and jeers from the other participants. This experience of the NGO Forum left a deep impact on Jewish civil society. Joel Fiss, president of the World Congress for Jewish Students, the World Union for Jewish Students, present at the NGO Forum, described the impact as follows. Before Durban, the large majority of Jewish public opinion basked comfortably in the peaceful days of the 90s. Durban reminded the Jews not to get too cocky. Hatred can resurface with no prior notice. This impact of Durban was emphasized and in many ways shaped by the shock of September 11th and the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York just days after the government conference closed. So in a 2011 retrospective on the conference, Canadian scholar and jurist Erwin Kotler wrote, "If 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror, Durban was the Mein Kampf." So these quotations were very evocative and they illustrate a palpable sense of crisis, alarm, and trauma on both an individual and collective level, which the events of the NGO Forum in Durban evoked. But I also argue that Durban impacted the course of Jewish advocacy in anti-racism spaces in Durban and in different, and very practical ways. My research points to two changes to the direction of anti-Jewish advocacy after 2001, which reflect the impact of the World Conference Against Racism. Both, I suggest, can be illustrated by Jewish advocacy in the European Monitoring Centre on Racism and Xenophobia. The EUMC, the European agency charged with gathering and disseminating information on racism, would publish the first working definition of anti-Semitism in March 2005, just under 4 years after the UN conference. The EUMC definition, for those who are not familiar, was slightly reworked and became the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition in 2016. The documents aren't identical, but they're very similar. The road to the EUMC definition began shortly after Durban concluded. I don't have enough time here to go to a very detailed history of the document, but I'm going to draw out certain aspects of this history to illustrate the impact of the Durban conference on Jewish engagement with international anti-racism going forward. The EUMC document wasn't necessarily the first definition of anti-Semitism that was written and published, but it was the first by a non-Jewish organization who are expressly interested in matters of anti-racism and discrimination, and with which there was a strong Jewish engagement. So I'm going to discuss two aspects of Jewish advocacy in the UMC at this time, which were implicit at Durban, but more explicitly articulated in the aftermath. So the very first is the demand for separate programs to address anti-Semitism within and beyond anti-racism. In 2001, Jewish NGOs requested that the EUMC carry out a specialist survey into increased reports of anti-Semitic incidents in Europe. This request was put in before the conference. In the framing of the survey, it was evident that the EUMC understood anti-Semitism and Islamophobia to be connected and fought on the same platforms through a joint approach. Jewish NGO representatives who had been present in Durban pushed back against the EUMC's inclusivity. They articulated that the conference had shown that inter-community dialogue was not necessarily a straightforward solution. Instead, anti-Semitism required specialist treatment on its own terms. It was out of these discussions that the need for a definition came to light in the EUMC, which sent a definitive message that anti-Semitism could not be encapsulated under the anti-racism umbrella alone, and not without special methods and expertise. The second shift in Jewish advocacy was a stronger call for recognition of anti-Zionism as a particular threat to Jews. This played out in debates about the aforementioned definition in the EUMC. The Jewish NGOs criticized the EUMC's own early efforts to define anti-Semitism and argued that these did not adequately capture anti-Zionism and therefore did not reflect the reality of contemporary anti-Semitism. As a result, Jewish NGOs themselves became involved in the final shape of the EUMC definition, many the European Jewish Congress and the American Jewish Committee. Their involvement pushed the dial on the ongoing intellectual and political debate over the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. The final EUMC definition drawn up by NGO representatives is one attempt to formalize this idea that anti-Semitism was changing, and some of the examples speak directly to claims brought against Israel in Durban. I'm not sure how clear this slide is, but for example, claiming that the state of Israel is a racist endeavor or applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other nation. The EUMC is just one outcome, among others, of changes to Jewish advocacy after Durban in international anti-racism spaces. The document and its development clearly illustrate first an effort to carve out a separate space for Jewish experiences away from the anti-racism umbrella, and second, a space in which to draw attention to what some saw as the changing nature of anti-Semitism. This change was a reaction to the anti-racism space itself. In many ways, these changes were a response to longer-term shifts in anti-racist mobilization, whose focus on anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism were no longer compatible with mainstream Jewish advocacy and, crucially, the place of Israel within it. In this process, Durban was one critical milestone in unraveling the already much strained relationship between Jewish NGOs and international anti-racism. Thank you very much for listening. That concludes the presentation. I see I finished quite early. I hope I didn't speak incredibly quickly. Shall I stop sharing that now?
Thank you, Emilie. All the more time for questions and discussions. So, well, that was very, very interesting and very clear. One of the things for me, what is most striking about the account that you give, and I suppose because I've read previous iterations of this, it is a bit different from previous accounts, is the emphasis that I think you rightly give to the other agenda at Durban concerned with reparations for the slave trade and for colonialism and for issues around debt forgiveness. And what it seems to me, I take from that part of your story, is that there was a clash between Jewish NGOs who thought about racism in one way and NGOs from the global south who were thinking about it in a different way. So one question is if you could say something more about those different conceptions of racism and how they differed. But the other question I have is that I wonder whether the emphasis that came from the Jewish NGOs afterwards on the real presence of anti-Semitism at Durban, and then the impact of 9/11 almost straight afterwards, whether that has prevented Jewish NGOs from actually ever coming to terms with that, ever actually facing that as a question, that they saw the issue as one of anti-Semitism, which I agree was present, and didn't really face up to the more profound problem, which is that there were different conceptions of racism in play here.
Thank you. Those are two really interesting, good questions. So firstly, on the sort of the clash of different conceptions of racism, I'd say it's probably also maybe not completely accurate to speak of it in such binary terms. And I mean, other things that the Jewish NGOs did make clear in their submission was that they supported claims for reparations and that they broadly supported that cause. So I think there wasn't an explicit detraction, but there was also a broader sort of divide between the Global South NGOs at the forum and NGOs from the Global North, who tended to see, so for example, we've got sort of amnesties and human rights watches and sort of more established professional NGOs were put in opposition to more sort of grassroots NGOs who represented the Global South. And that was also fought out in the sort of control, like who had control over the NGO forum. So there was many layers to this clash. And Jewish NGOs were embedded in that clash in a particular way. But it wasn't just Jewish NGOs versus every other NGO as well. So it's slightly more complex than I've maybe made out in the presentation. I'd say, yeah, I mean, the different conceptions of racism. So I think the idea of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism being foundational to the anti-racism expressed at the conference and which structured the conference was the dividing line. And it placed more attention on structural issues of racism and historic issues of racism, and rather than perhaps looking at racism as an individual prejudice, which can be approached through dialogue and training. So those were two ideas which definitely came out and Jewish NGOs probably sat on one end of that spectrum, partly because of their connection to the north rather than the south, and partly because of the place of Israel within the anti-imperialist conception of racism, which dominated. I had something else to say on that as well, which was, I can't quite remember, I might come back to it.
It's okay.
The memory of the conference and how I think because it was quite so striking and caused such a sense of crisis in communal organizations, partly due to 9/11, I think that really did prevent. I think it has prevented, certainly in the historiography, where it comes out much more clearly, but a lot of the writing on Durban does come from first-hand accounts. There is a real failure to engage with the deeper context of anti-racism, and I mean, there's quite a lot of sort of point, and Durban's often drawn out as a prime example of new anti-Semitism in the left and the anti-racism cause, but there's a lot less engagement with the conception of racism and looking more deeply at those political trends and the history of that. So yeah, absolutely, it's had an impact.
Thank you, Emilie. We have a number of people with their hands up. Let's take 2 questions at once and then work through them in that way. So first of all, Brian Schlug, and then Nira Yuval Davis. Brian. Do you want to unmute yourself, Brian?
Am I unmuted now?
We can hear you, Brian, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Emilie, for that very informative and clarifying talk. I have just one point of information that I want to raise. my understanding is that the so-called EUMC definition was never adopted by the management board of the EUMC, and that therefore it was never, formally speaking, the EUMC definition. It was a definition that was posted on the EUMC website that was produced by the task force, to which I think you referred or alluded. But it came to be called the EUMC definition as though it had that imprimatur. But I believe I'm right in saying that it never was, in fact, formally adopted, and my correspondence with the EUMC subsequently seemed to confirm that. But I wonder what light you could shed on that.
Nira, would you like to ask your question now?
Sure. First of all, I attended the conference in Durban, not as part of the Jewish bloc, but as a president of the research committee on racism, nationalism, and ethnic conflict of the International Sociological Association. And a couple of things that you mentioned that disturbed me very much at that conference as well. One was the fact that all legitimate racism was constructed as something that came from the north to the south. I remember in the preparatory meeting in Geneva, I raised this point, and I actually had members of a couple of racialized minority groups within Africa coming to thank me after the meeting. Of course, it was not followed. And the second thing was the very saliency of anti-Semitic cartoons and literature in the conference. However, because the Jewish bloc insisted on identifying anti-Semitism with any critique of Israel, it has created a terrible, terrible damage to any cause of against anti-Semitism, because it was so clear what Israel was doing to the Palestinians that it almost legitimized anti-Semitism if any critique of what Israel is doing is anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, today, we are bearing the fruit of this so much more. So I think this has been absolutely devastating. And I absolutely agree with you that after the conference, a new chapter in the whole debate has happened. And the contestations between, it's not even definitions, it's narratives about what racism is in terms of, and of course, it's not just by the Jewish lobby. Dan Abbott expressed this on the other side much as well. I think is very, very dangerous, and to Jews more than others. But just one last point, this was not the only regional conflict in terms of racism that was focused on this conference. For example, the cause of the Dalits in India was very central at that conference.
Thank you, Nira. Emilie, would you like to respond to both those?
Yes. So first, Brian, yeah, I mean, thank you for raising that. I think there's a bit of a historical grey area over that. I mean, my understanding is that it wasn't, the definition itself was not adopted by the EUMC management board either, but it was published by the director on the website, and then subsequently became an official definition, I suppose, by virtue of being published on the website. But I'm not sure what exactly would have, I suppose it's semantics of whether it became official or not, but it gained a sort of status, and although it was fairly short-lived, it's obviously endured in different forms. But yeah, so I think there was a clash between the director of the EUMC and the management board over the publication of the definition, and eventually she took it into her own hands. But that's my understanding of it, but I think there are different historical accounts. Just to respond to Nira, yeah, thank you very much for sharing your experiences. I think it really sheds light on why the conference has become such a sort of almost a mythical event in terms of its status in current talking about anti-Semitism and the history of contemporary anti-Semitism. and also does overlook the fact that there were lots of different issues at play there, so different ideas of racism between different groups, and groups such as the Roma people and the Dalits also made a lot of progress with their causes at the conference. So there were also significant successes that came out of it.
Thank you, Emilie. So another two questions or comments. First of all, Joseph Finlay, and then Conrad Cohen. Joseph.
Hi, thanks so much, Emilie, for that. I'm just struck by the sort of the question of when the new anti-Semitism discourse re-emerged or grew again after its kind of birth in the late 60s. And obviously, people often think about it now as emerging after 9/11, but you showed that it was in play at the conference and was put forward by the various Jewish advocacy groups. And I'm just interested to know how much earlier it was growing in popularity. Was it, had it started, you say, I think you suggested it started growing in popularity after the start of the Second Intifada in late 2000, but I wonder if it goes back earlier than that, and if you can just give us a sort of little timeline of when and where and how you think it was growing in the years preceding that.
Thank you, Joseph. Conrad.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Emilie, for such a clear and detailed presentation. Not to plug my own research, but I'm currently researching the impact of anti-Semitism in the actor training discipline, and I'm presenting a paper later this week on it. And your presentation spoke to me in many significant ways. In particular, what was quite striking was the very hyper-focused, the hyperfixation on two outputs of anti-racism are dealing with the huge area of the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism, and then the other one is calls for Palestinian rights, which seem very, in relation to each other, seem quite disproportionate. And I suppose my question is in relating to thinking about anti-racist practice in my particular discipline in theatre and actor training. In your impression, has this kind of fixation hampered wider anti-racist efforts in terms of successfully dismantling racism in our institutions, in our structures, in our practices, etc.?
Thank you both. I'll take Joseph's question first, and I'll come back to Conrad. So, great question. The emergence of new anti-Semitism discourse. So it's broadly dated to the 1960s in French-speaking literature, with a big resurgence after 1967 in English-speaking literature, and that's Jonathan Judican who writes about that. And the concept of a form of anti-Zionist or Israel-critical anti-Semitism, which is distinct from legitimate criticism of Zionism or Israel, has broadly circulated in different forms since that time. I mean, my research indicates that it's more useful to talk about concepts of new anti-Semitism in plural, because there are so many different components to what new anti-Semitism has been defined as. We could think about Holocaust denial, we can think about calling Israel a racist state, we can think about using the word genocide or Holocaust in different contexts. So there are lots of different versions of it, and what's always quite remarkable to me is that within the new anti-Semitism discourse, people tend to disagree and they qualify each other's claims, and there's a lot of different variations of what constitutes new anti-Semitism. So it's an incredibly broad concept with lots of different facets, which has tended to, in my understanding, has tended to respond to different geopolitical events, but also has specific domestic iterations into this. The conversation in Germany is different to the conversation in UK, and it resonates differently in different contexts. So I think broadly it had been growing since the 1960s in popularity, with sort of peaks around different geopolitical milestones, especially in Israel and involving Israel and Palestine. And then I think certainly in the 80s, I identify that as a real critical moment where it became more of a solid position in Jewish politics. And I think perhaps from the 2000s, we see it leaving Jewish politics and becoming much more popularized in maybe more mainstream political discourse. And 9/11 is certainly a big factor in that, but it was very much around beforehand. So addressing Conrad's question, your research sounds really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I'd say it's a really big question. I don't think I can speak to anti-racism in institutions and the fixation, if I understood correctly, the fixation on Palestine as a sort of disproportionate issue compared to the broader issue of anti-racism and how that maybe hinders anti-racist practice in institutions. I'm not sure I can speak to that entirely. I mean, certainly it's one criticism of the Durban conference and of the politics of the conference was that, and this came from NGOs from the Global South and NGOs working on other issues, was that the issue dominated the conference disproportionately and almost took away lots of the media attention from other issues. It took away a lot of the mileage of other issues. So in the end, NGO documents weren't actually presented to the state conference, and they were actively condemned by Mary Robinson, who was the secretary of the state conference. So the controversy around it certainly took away from the power the NGO forum could have, and there's a lot of anger around that. However, I think there's also, in the politics of the conference, others argue that it made a lot of sense because it was very topical at the time. I mean, obviously still is, but especially on second intifada was unfolding. So I think it was essentially a division of tactics between different people in the NGO forum. And Sangoka, who were organizing, were active supporters of Palestinian rights, and they pushed a lot for that. So I think it was also a tactical choice to draw attention to different issues. Whether or not it's useful or hinders debate, I can't really say, but there are different takes on that in relation to Durban.
Thank you, Emilie. And now another two questions or comments. First from Ronnie Fraser, and then Doug Rosenau. Ronnie.
Hi, thank you. I have comments, not actual questions. You don't although I got here late, you may have mentioned it, but Durban, the NGO forum at Durban, their declaration was a direct line to the BDS campaign. The BDS campaign resulted from the declaration in 2000, and it was launched in 2005. Right. The reason I mention this is because my wife and I have edited a book about BDS, challenging BDS, 20 years of responding to anti-Israel campaigns. We have two chapters in there about Durban. One was written by Mark Posniak, who was an 18-year-old student at the conference, and it's a very emotive and narrative of what happened. And if you're interested in what went on at the conference, I suggest you read it, because it was, as a student, he was totally overcome, because he went there expecting it to be about racism, and it wasn't, and it turned out to be an anti-Semitism fest. Is about the best way. When you moving on, Brian Klug, with his comments about the EUMC definition, he's quite correct. It was never officially adopted by the EUMC. However, it was used by many EU states so that they could train their police and judiciary. And interestingly, it was translated into 33 languages for the 56 members of the OSCE. Now, I've also got some photographs of all the what went on, which were taken at Durban, if you're interested. Finally, I've also written an essay in the book about the IRA definition, which goes into which explains how the EUC definition came about. I think your site, when you said, believe you said, Emily, it just evolved. It evolved because the EUMC was trying to measure anti-Semitism in their member states very early on, 2002, 2003. And what they did, they didn't have a measure, didn't have any way of identifying or telling the member states who were saying they have anti-Semitic incidents. So it evolved from that. They developed the EUMC definition for that reason. And that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. Doug.
Thank you. And I want to thank Emilie Wiedemann for a fascinating presentation. I do have a question. And that is about, it is about the UN side of things, the UN commissions and committees dealing with racism, and that touched on the Palestine question. And the question I have is whether you think that the climate of discussion and the whole cultural sort of ambiance of the Durban conference was affected by the near-term background of events in Israel and Palestine in the late 1990s, which featured, the collapse of the Oslo system and the Second Intifada, or whether you see that, the UN Commission sort of subculture as proceeding pretty much in a straight line fashion from the 1970s, when the UN General Assembly, it passed a resolution calling Zionism a form of racism or racial discrimination. In 1991, the UNGA rescinded that resolution under pressure from the United States. So do you see a sort of back and forth history within the UN, or do you see, with near-term events, particularly in Israel and Palestine, having an impact? Or do you see this just as building in a pretty continuous way from the late 60s and 70s all the way through to the early 2000s? Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Before you answer that, Emilie, if it's okay, there's just one more. One more hand up. So, Gail Chester, would you like to ask your question or make your comment?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Two quick things. Well, one quicker than the other. The EUMC definition that you flashed up, I'd really like to look at that, partly because I'd like to see how it looks compared to the IHRA one, and I don't know whether it might be still somewhere else up on the website, whether it's, because I'm not very deeply into the history of all this. The other point is that I'm very interested in the conflicts or power relationships that may have existed within the Jewish caucus, because you haven't really mentioned that. And I think that whilst maybe, the majority position would have been as you described it, I think, the whole situation does require more nuance, shall we say. We're looking at, in some cases, very big and powerful and maybe American, dare I say, influenced organizations, as opposed to smaller, Jewish NGOs or individuals who might take a somewhat different position anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Emilie, there's one last hand that we'll take and then allow you to respond.
Okay.
George Wilkes.
Hi,
George.
thank you. Thank you, David, and thank you, Emilie. Great overview. And I want to ask, do you think that Jewish organizations preparing for Durban were surprised by what happened, should have been surprised by what happened? And on what basis do you believe we can judge what Jewish advocacy organizations were doing in their preparations? For instance, some of them were working in Congo. Their experience of working with other NGOs was not in this Durban context. Some of them had previous experience of world conferences, for instance, in Beijing, Israeli and Palestinian women attempting to dialogue, that breaking down. Do we get these, the reason I raise this is when we get these discourses about Durban, there is a lot, they're heavy on shock and sometimes, and light on context. And so your help, I see your work will really help us to think about how we should judge Jewish organizations, in terms of the context that they came from, and then in the years to follow, maybe that's a separate operation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments and questions. I'll just take George's question first because it's the freshest in my mind and I didn't take notes. But I think it's a really interesting point. To what extent were they surprised? Should they have been surprised? I think there was a broad expectation that it would be a difficult conference. But I think that expectation came from the state conference, that it would be a state forum to condemn Israel, and that would be a big issue that they had to tackle, and they worked closely with the Israeli government on the state advocacy side of things. I think the NGO conference came as much more of a surprise. Should it have done? I'm not sure. I mean, you mentioned Congo. I think there was a lot of, and this ties in more to Gail's point, but it was that there was a lot of the Jewish NGOs who were participating broadly came from, remember the Jewish caucus were sort of American, European, quite established NGOs, would have had experience working with Congo and other more established NGOs, but Durban was a slightly different. It came during a time of an explicit effort from the UN of trying to increase NGO participation in world conferences. So it had the broadest participation of NGOs of any world conference. And lots of these were grassroots global South conferences. So this was an explicit effort from the UN to include a broader selection of NGOs. So I think it was quite a novel context for an NGO forum. And I do think that came as a surprise. So I hope that sort of addresses your question. If I can then return to sort of Ronnie's point, thank you for raising that. You're right, there was a lot more to the EUMC definition than I put in the presentation. I tried to focus more on Durban than EUMC, but there was a lot more to the history than I explained there. So Doug, your question about sort of the back and forth in the UN and what the UN's role in all this is. I mean, I think the 1975 resolution sort of formed a lot of the background for how Jewish NGOs engaged in the conference and how the topic of anti-Semitism and the topic of Israel was sort of very interconnected in the politics of the conference. And there is a certain amount of continuity, but I think, so of course there was the geopolitical context, but certainly from the UN after 1991, there was a sense of optimism around the issue and especially I think it wasn't just that. I think it was the repeal. I think it was the end of sort of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the repeal of 3379, which was in part a consequence of that, or was allowed by that, and then also the end of apartheid in South Africa, all created this sense of optimism around dealing with these issues in the UN in the 90s, which then quickly sort of fell apart as the Oslo Accords also fell apart, and then Second Intifada began. So I think at the inception of the World Conference and the very early stages of planning in the 90s, there was a sense of optimism in the UN, which then did fall apart as the old patterns came back, which wasn't necessarily expected, but the politics of the 1970s sort of re-emerged in different forms, if that makes sense. And then just finally want to address Gail's questions. First, the EUMC definition is available online. If you do a Google search and scroll down, you will be able to find it. And a few PDFs knocking about. And that's an important question about the power relations between Jewish NGOs. I mean, there were, of course, Jewish people and groups who attended the conference who weren't part of the Jewish caucus, and I try to be clear that I'm focusing on the Jewish caucus activities and not sort of a united Jewish stance outside of that. There were also groups of anti-Zionist rabbis who were at the conference and were explicitly against the Jewish caucus, so there was also that going on. And within the Jewish caucus itself, there is a bias in that these were NGOs from the global north, so American, European NGOs, also South African. And although they did broadly adhere on lots of points, they represent a very specific part, or a certain part of Jewish politics, of mainstream Jewish politics, perhaps we could call it, which is related to their status as established NGOs in their respective countries and internationally as well. So we're getting a very, you could call it mainstream sort of establishment view, which of course does not reflect the diversity of Jewish politics around these issues. So that's obviously needs to be made very clear. I think that's everyone, but tell me if I've missed something.
Well, thank you very much, Emilie. Thank you to everyone who's asked a question or who has made a comment, and thank you all for giving up your lunchtime. But above all, our thanks to Emilie for a fascinating paper, which managed both to be crystal clear and extremely stimulating. So thank you all very much indeed.